So now what we're going to get into are the basic building blocks of living things. So the chemistry that's behind all the biology. So we really can't get into the structure of cells, say the membrane of a cell, without understanding the molecules that build the membrane, which would be, say, phospholipids and proteins. But if you want to know what a phospholipid is, we have to understand a few things, because the chemistry of that molecule is going to have certain properties, meaning some parts of it may like water, some parts of it may not like water, and that's how the structure is going to form because of those properties. But if we don't know what those properties are or why those properties occur, then it's somewhat pointless to study or anything about the phospholipid, because you really have no idea what it is except a word. But the idea here is that you have some understanding of what it actually is and how it behaves. And if we're going to do that, you have to know a little bit of the chemistry. So this, hopefully for some people, is very easy in review if you've had some of this in high school. If not, then it's all new, but there's just some specific terms and specific points that you're going to need to know. So we have something else. I talked about cell theory in a previous lecture. We have also atomic theory. All matter is made of atoms. Okay, so often atoms are the smallest unit of matter, that sort of thing. Now, technically, what we're going to talk about, the things that are within atoms, the things that make up the atoms, smaller than atoms, and actually there are things even smaller than those that make those things up. So we can really get into much smaller things, but the basic concept that we work with is that how we explain everything, from us to cells to this table or to this pen, everything is made up of chemical molecules, and those things are made up of atoms, and that's the unit that we work with. Okay, so that's the smallest unit. Now, what's an atom? Well, it's made up of then smaller particles. So atoms have, so it's the smallest unit. All things are made of matter, smallest unit of matter. How about that? So smallest unit of matter. I'm crunching in the corner here because there's a lot of other stuff I'm going to be drawing in the middle, but kind of put atomic theory there on the side. We'll keep it there. So we're talking about atoms. So atoms are made up of usually three different things: the protons, neutrons, and electrons. So they're often referred to as subatomic particles. So they're what makes up the atom, smaller than the atom. So what about these things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine? What are those called? Right? Those are elements. So what's the difference between an atom and an element? It's that elements are just specific versions of an atom. All right, so specific versions of atoms are the elements. So what do you mean by versions? Well, I said atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So the elements are defined by a certain number of these things, okay? But not really all these things. Turns out that when we go to define an element, all that really specifically matters in naming and identifying that element are the number of protons, okay? And so we call this here atomic number. Okay, so that's the number of protons. And that's what defines an element. So here we have carbon with 6. So that means there are 6 protons. Nitrogen has 7 protons. That's what makes an atom. That's nitrogen atom. Nitrogen because it has 7 specific protons. It doesn't have 8, it doesn't have 6, it has 7. That's specifically for, okay? Oxygen has 8, fluorine has 9, neon has 10. So for our class as well, how much of the periodic table do you need to know? Really not a whole lot. What we're going to find is that about 96% of all living things, well, I should say 96% of the matter that makes up all living things, so we'll say organic, because that's making up living things, matter is made up of carbon, so I'll write it out, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. So hydrogen is not over here. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so these 4 elements, that's it. C, N, O, H, those 4 make up just about everything. Okay, then there's some others. If we add in phosphorus and sulfur, we kind of get up to, let's say, like 99%. And there's all kinds of other elements. Well, what about iron? What about sodium and chlorine and potassium? And those things all are important. Sodium and potassium probably be in here, but these are the core ones that we're going to be focused on, mostly also in this particular class. So you don't have to know the whole periodic table. There's a couple elements, like 4 elements. Really, if you know these 4 elements, you're pretty good. And that's just about it. All right. So what about this atomic number, the protons, and then these other things? So what about the electrons and the neutrons? Generally, for most elements, the number of protons, which are positively charged, so plus there, equals the number of electrons, which are negatively charged, and that's the same as the number of neutrons, which have no charge or are neutral. So you have protons, neutrons, electrons. So that means if I asked you, how many electrons does a carbon atom have? You could say, well, let's see, 6. But wait, 6 is the number of protons, but it should be the same. So protons and neutrons should be the same, and electrons should be the same. So they should all be the same. But we don't define an element by the number of electrons. So if we say, oh, hey, here's an element with 6 electrons, so it must be carbon, that's not necessarily true. Because elements can gain or lose electrons and become something called ions, which we'll talk about. So these are elements who've gained or lost electrons. They're still the same element because the name, the definition of that element is based on protons, not electrons. So it would be an ion of oxygen or fluorine, something like that. Some elements tend to ionize more so than others. Others don't really tend to gain or lose, electrons, and some of them do. That's based on some things we'll talk about a little bit here. So electron shell. So what's going to happen is that the protons and the neutrons are going to be organized into a nucleus of an atom. So this is going to be different than the nucleus of a cell. Sometimes people ask on an exam, what's in, say, the nucleus of a cell, specifically cell, and then we're not there yet, but the answer would be, say, DNA, the chromosomes, the genetic material. What's in the nucleus of an atom? That's the protons and neutrons. So if I say what's in the nucleus of an atom and you said DNA, that's not right. No, it's the protons and the neutrons, okay, that are there. So the protons, so let's just use carbon here as an example. There's 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and that's the nucleus or the core of a carbon atom. Now it's also going to have 6 electrons. The electrons then are outside. So what's really important here is that it is the behavior, and I'm going to erase some of this here because I need a little bit more of the space. So actually, just so keep in mind, I'll talk about these elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. All right, but I'm going to erase them from here because I need a little bit of that room. Okay, so the electrons are going to define, the protons define who an element is. The electrons are going to define the behavior. of an element. So, or of, an atom of that element. So how do they behave? What do I mean by behave? I mean, how do they interact with other atoms? So do they ignore other atoms? Do they interact? Do they bump into them and attach to them? Do they push them away? What do they do? How do they interact with each other? And that interaction is going to be based on electrons, not the protons. Protons are involved a little bit in other sorts of more complex ways, but I think it's probably beyond this class to get into all those sorts of details. So we're covering the basics here. So if there's 6 protons and 6 neutrons, there has to be 6 electrons. And so where are they? Are they just like anywhere? Well, they're kind of contained in shells. And shells are also, say, the equivalent of energy levels. And what we have is sort of an energy level, say a first energy level, and only 2 electrons can be in that area. That's it. So if you're an element who only has 2 electrons, then that's it, and you're full. If you're an element who only has 1 electron, then you have 1 electron here, and that's it. But if you're an element, like most, who have more than 2 electrons, they can't go there. They have to go into a next shell, a second shell. Now the second shell, so second shell, it's full at 8 electrons. First shell, full at 2 electrons. All right, and then this here is our atomic nucleus. So with 6 electrons, that means 2 in the first. That means we have 4 left over. So those 4 are going to go in this next shell. Now the electrons are negative in terms of charges. Charges usually attract if they're opposite. So positive and negative pull together, but the same charge repels. So positive repels positive, negative repels negative. So these negative electrons tend to move away from each other, and they distribute themselves like this, right, in this electron shell. So this would be a carbon atom, and the rules, what I'm doing here is establishing not just the structure of a carbon atom, but the rules for all the elements and how they're protons, neutrons. Now we're not going to worry about neutrons much, so I'll keep mentioning them off and on because they're there. They're not going to have anything to do with anything we're doing in this class, so don't really worry about them. The two things are the protons define the element, the electrons define the behavior of the element and how they interact with and how they bond with other elements to start to form our molecules. All right, so those are the things you have to know a little bit about what they are, where they are, what they do, and so forth. It's supposed to be a carbon atom. So let's say, what's the difference, say, between a carbon atom and an oxygen atom? So go down here. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8. Right, so that'd be 8 protons, 8 neutrons. That's in an atomic nucleus. And it's going to have 8 electrons, right? So we put the electrons in a shell. 8, so okay, we got 2, that goes into the first shell, but we have 6 more, so we then do a second shell. And we go 1, 2, 3, 4, exactly like we did here. But now 5, 6, so there's a total of 8. 6 plus 2, that's the 8. The important thing about this, so what I'm showing you here is these 2 electrons are paired. Okay, and these 2 electrons are paired. These 2 electrons here and here are unpaired. And even though I had just said the electrons repel each other, electrons also form these pairs where they come together. And so this is, again, something more for your chemistry class. It's more detail, like why they repel, why they don't, why they come together. Okay, so for right now, if you take chemistry, you'll get into that in a lot more detail, but some of this we're already bordering on the edge of like too much content really for your class as a non-major. So I'm trying to keep it as necessary as possible. So I'm not going to go into all the extra information here. Right. But this is the way it works out. They're paired and these are unpaired. The unpaired electrons are going to try to form pairs. Or another way of saying this is that electron shells that are not full are going to strive to become full. So what does that mean? It means this shell is full with 8 electrons, but it only has 4. Okay, so carbon has 4 of 8 electrons, of 8 possible. Right? Oxygen has 6 electrons of 8. You can say, wait a minute, doesn't it have 8? I'm only talking about the outer shell. See, the inner shell's already paired, so it's not interacting with anything else. There's no interactions. It's the next shell where we have, say, unpaired electrons. Those are the ones who are going to behave, are going to interact with other things. What are they going to try and do in their interaction? Well, they're going to try to form the pairs, and they're going to try to fill this shell. This is related to bonding. Elements will form bonds or links with other elements. The reason they form bonds is because the electrons are trying to form these pairs. Right? They're trying to, the elements themselves are trying to fill their outer shells. And so, for example here, carbon needs 4 electrons to fill that shell. It has 4, it needs 4, right? It needs 4 electrons so it can form 4 bonds, 4 chemical bonds, 4 bonds with other elements. So because it needs 4 more electrons. Oxygen, for example, needs 2 electrons, right? It has 6 out of 8, so it can still take 2 more. So that means with other elements, it can form 2 bonds, right? And this is a real key thing. The number of bonds an element forms is based on how many electrons it requires to fill the outer shell. That's a very important concept into how the elements interact with other elements, right? They're constantly going to be interacting to try and fill those outer shells, okay? So carbon needs 4, nitrogen needs 3, oxygen needs 2, fluorine only needs 1, and what about neon here, right? So I'll erase the atomic theory now. Let's do a real super simple one for neon. Now neon has, so it has its 10 protons, 10 neutrons. Sorry, I did that in a different color, so it might throw you off. Okay, that's a nuclear, atomic nucleus, okay? So then it has 10 electrons, so that means it would get 2, and that means it would get 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So how many does it have in that outer shell? 8. 8 out of 8. That means it's full. That means how many does it need? None. So how does it behave? How does it interact with other atoms? It doesn't. There's no interaction. So there are elements on the far right side. If you look at a periodic table, along the right side of the periodic table, those elements are sometimes called noble gases or inert gases. Inert means non-reactive, non-interactive. It means they don't interact with anything else. They form no bonds or interactions, and that's because they are already full, so they have no reason to interact with anything else. Whereas so we don't work with this one. So all the other elements need electrons, so they interact with other atoms. So it's why elements interact with other elements. It's so they can try and fill these shells. okay? And that forms, and that interaction is usually in the form of what we call a bond, or a chemical bond. So I'm going to erase some of the stuff so I have some more room to kind of keep going here. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about next, okay? So the formation of these bonds. So hopefully this makes some sense to you, and the great advantage as watching this as a video is you can pause it and you could rewind it if you missed whatever I said, and if this is all stuff that you've had in another class, you can kind of fast forward a little bit too, and you can just jump on to the next part and see if that's something that you already know, or if that's something you need to still have explained to you, okay? So that gives you a little bit freedom and flexibility with how you kind of navigate through the class, right? So the next thing we want to do is start to put together some of these elements to try to build molecules. And so what I'm going to do in this now drawing, instead of drawing the whole atom with all of its electrons and the protons and the nucleus and everything else, there's a shorthand, a more simplistic way of doing this. And that's where we just focus on the electrons in the outer shell, because we said the outer shell electrons are the ones that are going to behave and interact with other things. So like, for example, if I have the carbon, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons in the second shell, so that's all we draw for a carbon. I didn't put it up here, but another element that was one of the 4 I said they were really important that you needed to know was hydrogen. Okay, this is H for hydrogen. Probably the most abundant element in all of your body, in all biochemical molecules. It would be hydrogen. So hydrogen has 1 proton, 1 electron, no neutrons. There are no neutrons. So it's not protons equals electrons equals neutrons. For this case, it's just protons, electrons. That's all. That's all hydrogen atom is. So if we had a hydrogen atom, so that's a hydrogen, it just has 1. But that's 1 out of how many can it still take, or how many does it require to fill itself up? It only needs 1 more, right? Because if it has 1, that means it's 1 proton in the core, in the nucleus, right? And then surrounding that is just 1 shell with 1 electron, so it only needs 1 more. Which means it can only form 1 bond. And this will relate to, say, concepts. So say on your exam, there'll be written, like I said, written questions, and you might have to draw things and solve problems to really demonstrate you understand things, as opposed to you can just copy things down. And so I'll ask you questions related to maybe drawing some of these structures or linking them together and then explaining how or why they link together in a specific way. And so, for example, here, hydrogen, since it only has 1 electron and 1 proton, it only needs 1, it can only form 1 bond. So maybe the way I do these questions is I ask you something like this. Which of these 2 structures is drawn correctly? This is kind of the point, this is kind of what we're getting to, right? So I'm kind of leading us along there as quickly as I can. Water, H2O. H2O. So is it 2H or 2 O's? Right? If you understand a little bit of this, you don't have to memorize that. You can look at it and actually understand, right? And know the correct answer just by looking at the drawing and knowing this information. Hydrogen needs 1 electron, which means it can form 1 bond. Here we have a hydrogen with 1 bond. Here we have a hydrogen with 1 bond. Here we have a hydrogen with 2 bonds. Can hydrogen form 2 bonds? No, it can't form 2 bonds. It doesn't form 2 bonds like that. It's not possible to form 2 bonds. Oxygen, if you remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oxygen needs 2 more electrons, so it can form 2 bonds. There's 2 bonds. Hydrogens with 1, that makes sense. And that is the structure of water. And we're going to get into this a little more detail in just a bit, since we put some of these things together. But you see what I'm saying? If you learn some basic rules, so you don't have to memorize a lot of things, because then you can just apply the rule to whatever bit of information you're given. And it'll hold true most of the time, at least as far as what we're going to do in this class. If you get into more advanced classes, you find most rules have exceptions. And then it's like, so this doesn't work like that. Those things sort of happen. But for now, we're going to only be looking at things that do follow the basic rules so you can understand the rules and the concepts. So if this is carbon and this is hydrogen, what can happen here is that they can interact with each other. They can form a bond, right? So this carbon and this hydrogen can interact with each other, and right there, this area where I drew these 2 right above one another, they are now sharing electrons. And that is a chemical bond. And that's called a covalent bond. Right, so a chemical bond is a type of chemical bond where elements share electrons with one another. Now, they could be the same element. It could be a hydrogen with a hydrogen, like that. He's sharing one, that's H2, hydrogen gas, right, which we have, right, which exists, right, and that occurs. Carbons and hydrogen. Now, in biological systems, you're going to have a lot of hydrocarbons. Carbon, hydrogen, this is going to be incredibly common. You're going to see this all over the place with everything, so this is why I'm bringing it up, because almost every biological molecule, whether it's DNA or RNA or proteins or sugars or lipids, are all going to have hydrogens attached to carbons. Sometimes that's all they are. Sometimes that's a big part of what they are, or just a little piece. But you're going to see that everywhere in just about every single thing. All right. And you can have many of these. You can have carbons bonded to hydrogens like this, and then you can, mix it up. It doesn't just have to be one element with itself, like the 2 hydrogens that I had here. So they're erased now that I'm talking about them, but again, you can just roll back and take a look at them, right? You can have 2 different elements, carbons with hydrogens, right? Or we can have 3 elements, so we can bring in this oxygen here. Say, hey, it needs 2 electrons. This guy needs another one. They can share one here. Right, so now the hydrogen full, 2 electrons. This one, 2, 2, 2. The oxygen, the carbons, we just focus on the carbon. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, it has its 8 because it's sharing electrons. The oxygen has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it still needs one more. So could be anything, but let's just say it's another hydrogen, okay? Because it's a common thing. Now, this is methanol, methyl alcohol, all right? And so that's kind of like how molecules, right, start to form, right? So whatever the molecule is, it's formed through an interaction between elements, where the elements are sharing electrons, trying to fill their outer shells of electrons, and they're only going to share as many as they have and or need, okay, to kind of fill those shells. So there's a specific definition or limit to what they can and will do, right, and how they behave, with each other. So that behavior then results in a bond, right, and this type of bond is called a covalent bond. Now, there are different types of covalent bonds, and this leads us to the next part. It becomes really important. In some of these cases, the electrons are shared equally. So it's kind of like, I'm giving you an electron, you give me an electron. I'll now give yours back, and I'll give you one of mine. And then you're going to give me mine back, and you're going to give me one of yours. And we're just going to keep going back and forth, exchanging evenly, equally with one another. Right? So there's one example where there's sharing of electrons and it's equal. Or I could give you one of my electrons and you could hold on to it and say thanks and just stare at me and not do anything, and I give it back and I'll be like, aren't you going to give me one? And you're like, I don't know if I feel like it right now. And now I'm missing one. Feel like I've lost that electron. And then maybe after some point in time, you decide, fine, I'll give you yours back and here's one. But just shortly after you do that, you regret it and say, nope, I want it back. And you take it right back. So that's called unequal sharing. It means you haven't stole it. You're not completely taking it and walking away. But you're not giving it back evenly or equally as well. And that's what some elements do with other elements. Some elements will share the electrons back and forth evenly, equally with one another. And other elements don't do that. If they share unequally, this will create what we call partial charges. And sometimes I like to refer to these, you won't find this in the textbook or anywhere else probably, but I find that it's easier for students to relate to it if you think about it like this. These are sometimes charges, meaning that what can happen here is, especially in this case, so I'll go through this briefly. Elements, so if it was a hydrogen with a hydrogen, and they were each sharing electrons, who's stronger, the hydrogen or the hydrogen? They're both hydrogen. They're going to share the same. Same thing here. If you have a carbon sharing with a carbon, they can be sharing with other things here, but this is the point right there where they're sharing with each other. Who's stronger, this carbon or that carbon? Not same, equal. So these are all equal sharing, where no charge is created. So no charge gets created when they share equally. Equal, equal, like this. Now there's an interesting thing here. Usually the same element, if it's an element sharing with itself, obviously they're the same, so it's going to be equal. Generally the rule is if they're just different elements, it's going to be unequal. Except for one very important case, which is this one here. So carbon and hydrogen, although they are different elements, they will share equally with one another. Okay, so, and that has to do with a lot of different things. I'll try to just give you a real quick, I can't give you the whole explanation for it. It's too long and it's too much probably for your class. But carbon, remember we said it has in that outer shell, right? It had of its own 1, 2, 3, 4. These pink ones here, 4 out of 8. So think about it. It means it's half full, or you could say half full, half empty, however you want to think about it, right? But it's half of what it needs. The hydrogen, right? It has 1 out of how many? 2. So it's technically, right? It only needs 1 more, but it's also half full or half empty, however you want to look at it. So they have something in common. Even though the numbers are totally different, there's some commonality. And there's a whole bunch of other things, which again, we're not going to really get into as far as why. Why the pull of the protons and the distance of the electron shells and these other properties affect the pull on electrons, and how these two elements tend to be equal, roughly equal, with one another, enough so that they don't create charges. Okay. So these we call nonpolar bonds, or nonpolar covalent bonds, because the electrons are shared equally and there's no charge. But when we have, and I'm going to end this lecture right here, and then that's where the next one will begin with water and pH. I'm going to do that as a separate one. It's not going to continue here. We'll end, take a break from this and go to the next one so I can reset everything. So we've got water or oxygen here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right? And then we have hydrogen. It says right here, 1, 1. So remember, that's our water molecule again. Oxygen with 6 electrons, hydrogen with 1 electron. They're each sharing electrons with one another. So these are covalent bonds. But now oxygen here, right, it has 6 out of 8 possible electrons. It has 6 electrons. Its shell will be full with 8, so that's why it forms 2 bonds, 1, 2, to make 8 electrons. So it's kind of closer to being full. So you could think about that. And I sometimes tell students this. The closer to full, the stronger the pull. And this is on electrons. So for elements, if you're looking at elements on the periodic table, if they're, so especially seeing now, as you go along in this direction here, this one has 7 out of 8, 6 out of 8, 5 out of 8, 4 out of 8. That's how many electrons in that outer shell. So who's stronger? Who's going to pull more on the other electrons? The one who's close. So of this group, we said neon is full. So he's not pulling on anything, doesn't need anything at all. Fluorine only needs 1, so it's super close, super strong, powerful, oxidizing, rips electrons from things. Oxygen needs 2 more, pretty close, but not quite there. So it's not as strong as fluorine, but it's strong. Of all the biological of the elements in biological molecules, oxygen's the most, what we call electronegative, or the one with the strongest pull on electrons, because it's the closest to being full of the ones I said. Remember, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen. Of those 4, it's the closest. Now technically say, but hydrogen only needs 1 more, so isn't it closer to being full? And you're correct if that's what you think. And like I said, you are correct. It's not just what you think, it's what you know, because that's accurate. Except, where does the pull come from? So think about it. What is actually pulling on the electrons? If they're negative in terms of charge, what attracts negative things? Positive things. Right? So it's actually the protons who pull. Hydrogen has 1 proton, oxygen has 8. So even though it only needs 1, it has the pull of a single proton on other electrons. Oxygen has the pull from its 8 protons, so it's stronger, right? So it's a stronger pull. Right? So like I said, there are certain rules, and they help us, but many times there's exceptions to the rules and things that break the rules. So this is kind of where we're going to start off with the next lecture. We'll start off with focusing on water, because water is sort of essential to life. It's going to make up more than 70% of most cells, which is, and you're made up of cells, right? So of everything that's alive is mostly made up of water. So, and everything likely came from water, came from the Earth's oceans, which are water. So life and water are integrally tied together. So in a biology class, even though this is chemistry, to study water is very important in studying life or living things and understanding certain characteristics and properties of water. So that's going to be our next focus of the next lecture, which will be much shorter than this one because it's just going to be tied to water, basic properties, hydrogen bonding, which we'll get into with the water, and then pH. Okay. And the ions will come back to again, actually, so that stuff will still be in it. And again, some of these things will reoccur, but now you've got the basic atomic chemistry that you require for the whole rest of the course, for the whole rest of the semester.